Welcome back to Indus News with me, Usman Lone. Well, we start from Britain, which says it's deploying a second warship in the Persian Gulf to support freedom of navigation amid rising tensions with Iran. Government officials say the move is part of a pre-planned rotation to ensure Britain's presence in the vital shipping lane. Foreign Minister Jeremy Hunt says London does not want to increase tensions with Tehran on the issue of a seized oil tanker. He says London's reacting to the situation in a very measured and careful way. Well, moving on to the United States, where the Pentagon says its plans to provide naval escorts to vessels in the Gulf. This comes a day after the UK accused Iran of impeding a British oil tanker near the Strait of Hormuz. Joint Chiefs of Staff nominee General Mark Milley said the US is working to build a naval coalition to protect commercial shipping near Iran. In a testimony to the US Congress, he said the coalition would be finalized in the next couple of weeks. Milley said freedom of navigation is fundamental and should be respected by Iran. Meanwhile, news reports say the US has delayed the imposition of sanctions on Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, and this has raised hopes of diplomatic engagement between the two countries. Now, Gibraltar arrests 2 more crew members of a detained Iranian tanker. Earlier, police arrested the captain and chief officer of the tanker. Police say the tanker breached EU sanctions by shipping oil to Syria. All 4 detainees are Indian nationals and are being questioned over suspected exports of crude oil to Syria. Gibraltar says the arrested crew have been accorded legal entitlement and consular access. Now, staying with Iran, and it's warned all of its foreign forces to leave the Middle East. Foreign Ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi said regional states are capable of maintaining security themselves. Iran said it will retaliate if Britain does not release its oil tanker. The Royal Marine seized the tanker last week on suspicion of breaking EU sanctions by taking oil to Syria. Mousavi accused the UK of taking action under US pressure. London's claimed Iranian forces impeded a British tanker near the Strait of Hormuz, and it was chased away by a Royal Navy warship. Well, in Syria, regime airstrikes killed 13 people in northwestern Idlib province. War monitors say 45 others were wounded in the attack. And they say government forces have regained land from militants in an advance on the village of Hamamiyat. Over 100 people have been killed in neighboring Hama province in the last 48 hours alone. Now, moving on to Afghanistan, where 6 people were killed in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan's eastern Nangarhar province. Officials said 14 others were wounded as a teenager targeted pro-government commanders at a wedding party. No group yet has claimed responsibility for the attack. And staying with Afghanistan, Human Rights Watch have called for Afghan commandos to be prosecuted after they killed 4 civilians during a raid on a medical center in central Afghanistan. In a statement, the charity said its deliberate attacks on the medical facilities and the killing of civilians constitute war crimes. Neither the Afghan Defense Ministry nor US forces in Afghanistan immediately commented. And it's not clear whether the US military had supported the Afghan troops in the July 8th raid. Now, in Sudan, a political transition agreement between the military and opposition is expected to be signed tomorrow. An African Union envoy says a joint sovereign council will rule the North African country for 3 years until elections are held. Earlier, the military said it thwarted another coup attempt launched to scuttle the power-sharing deal. State media said 16 serving and retired military officers were arrested. The military and pro-democracy alliance agreed on a joint several council last week to end the crisis since April. Venezuela's government and opposition agreed to set up a platform to resolve the country's political crisis. This comes after 3 days of brokered talks in Norway ended in Barbados. Norway's foreign minister says the parties will hold meetings to find a solution to the crisis. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says he developed 6 points with the opposition to pursue talks. But he did not specify what those points were. Opposition leader Juan Guaido's representative says his delegation would make consultations towards progress. A political crisis has gripped Venezuela since Guaido declared himself interim president of the country in January earlier this year. Now, the UN says 30 men sentenced to death by a Houthi court in Yemen were tortured during their 3-year detention. UN human rights spokesman Ravina Shabdasani urged the court to consider violations of their right to a fair trial. Indus News has this report.
30 men were arrested in 2016 and charged in April 2017 with allegedly participating in an armed group intending to carry out attacks on Houthi rebels. Shamdasani said most of them are academics, students and politicians affiliated with Islah Party that is critical of the Houthis.
We are deeply alarmed by the imposition of the death penalty on 30 people by the Specialized First Instance Criminal Court of the de facto authorities in Sana'a.
Yemen has been in the grip of a brutal civil war since 2015. According to the UN, the country is facing the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with over 22 million people in need of assistance.
China says it will slap sanctions on US firms involved in a potential arms sale worth over $2 billion to Taiwan. A foreign ministry spokesman says the arms sales violated the norms of international law. Earlier, Beijing's top diplomat Wang Yi warned the United States against a planned arms sale to Taiwan. Yi says no foreign force can stop the reunification of China and they should not try to intervene. US negotiators have met officials in New Delhi for trade talks amid strained ties over tariffs. The US delegation is being led by Assistant Trade Representative for South and Central Asia, Mr. Christopher Wilson. In addition to delegation-level talks, Wilson will meet India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. The US is also expected to press India to devise stricter rules for e-commerce. President Donald Trump this week reiterated his criticism of India's trade tariffs, calling them unacceptable. Well, for more on this, we're joined by our Mumbai correspondent, Rebecca Bundan. Rebecca, thanks for joining us. So, what is the current status of the trade conflict between both countries, especially after Trump and Modi just met during the G20 last month?
Yes, there was that meeting at the G20, and out of that it did emerge that the two sides did seem to want to sort out these very thorny trade issues that have been going on for some time. It's been quite a drawn-out trade dispute between the US and India over a number of issues. And now today there is that meeting taking place between US and Indian trade negotiators, also with the Commerce Ministry, Piyush Goyal as well. So we're seeing some sort of progress there, at least in terms of talks taking place, which it was revealed that something like this would happen. That emerged from that G20 meeting between Modi and Trump. However, we have to wait and see, has there been any kind of compromise between the two sides? Because both Modi and Trump do seem very set on taking quite protectionist measures when it comes to trade. And we have really seen this trade dispute escalate between India and the US over the past few weeks, with the US ending India's preferential trade status. That means for a lot of people, a lot of companies exporting goods from India to the US, including some textile products, auto components, they've been slapped with these higher duties, whereas before they were enjoying sort of duty-free status for certain products. And then we saw India reacting to that. It introduced its own retaliatory tariffs on goods, including almonds and apples and a number of other products as well. And then there's a lot of background to this as well. There have been a lot of issues, including India introducing e-commerce regulations that have impacted Amazon and Walmart, which have invested very, very heavily in the e-commerce sector in India. And they've had to basically change the way that they're doing business here because of these rules that were really quite suddenly introduced earlier this year.
Modi and Trump, they're two big figures and they're heads of populations of two big countries, let's say. But I mean, what happens if these talk fails? What kind of impact will it have on US-India future relations, Rebecca?
Absolutely. Then in that case, then this dispute is going to continue. This trade dispute will sort of rumble on, and we could see, the two sides taking further steps. So that's really the major concern here, that economists are quite concerned about that and the impact it could ultimately have on the Indian economy. Companies in the US are also concerned as well, because it affects them too. So it's not just India that's actually affected, although Trump talks about America first and buy American, hire American. When there are sort of disputes between countries, it is also American companies as well that do get affected. India sends a lot of IT workers to the US, for example. A lot of companies in Silicon Valley are heavily dependent on workers from India. And there's been a lot of talk about the H-1B visas, which a lot of skilled workers from India use to go over to the US. And if the US were then to move towards clamping down on those, which is something it has talked about and mentioned broadly as a policy, not just directed at India, of course, but at other countries as well, that's something that would impact a lot of companies both in the US and India. So, but just looking at what's taken place, it's very, very hard to see how they will come out with a solution in one day. We'll have to wait to see what's actually happened, what's actually emerged from these talks. But when we do see the official statements, for example, from the G20, very much the US and India are saying that they do want to work towards some kind of agreement and working out these issues. It's not really in either of their interests for this trade dispute to continue. Nobody is really actually gaining from it ultimately, if you look at the situation in terms of economics and how it actually affects businesses.
Rebecca, thanks. That was our Mumbai correspondent, Rebecca Bundan, there joining us from Mumbai. Now, Turkey said it has taken delivery of the first batch of parts for a Russian air defense system that strained ties with its NATO partners, especially the US. The Defense Ministry says components for the S-400 missile system will continue to arrive over the coming months. Turkey placed its order for the advanced Russian system into April 2017. Urging Turkey to instead buy its similar Patriot system, the US has threatened to expel it from the F-35 warplane program. Washington argues that the S-400 missile system is incompatible with the NATO's defense network and could compromise the F-35. Turkey has stressed that the S-400 will not be integrated into NATO systems and is not a threat to the alliance. Ankara has called for a joint commission to determine the facts, but the US has not yet responded. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky have spoken, breaking a 5-year diplomatic silence. In talks held over the phone, the two leaders agreed to continue high-level discussions. The Kremlin says Putin and Zelensky discussed the conflict in eastern Ukraine and an exchange of prisoners. They agreed to continue bilateral dialogue. Moscow says the possibility of continued diplomatic contacts through the Normandy format was also considered. Now, this comes after Zelensky called for Western-mediated talks with Russia. The conflict started after Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula in 2014 among international outcry. Well, for more on this, we're joined now in Moscow by Harry Horton. Harry, thanks for joining us here. So, I mean, it's been 5 years since a Russian president even spoke to a Ukrainian one. So, how significant is the resumption of dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, Harry?
Well, it is significant. It's a first step. We shouldn't get too carried away with this. It's just a brief telephone call between the two leaders. But the fact that they are talking would be encouraging for those who are looking for peace in eastern Ukraine. That, we are told, based on the statements released by both the Kremlin and the Ukrainian Prime Minister's office, was the bulk of the talks, the conflict in eastern Ukraine and this prisoner swap between the two countries, possible prisoner swap between the two countries. Earlier, before this phone conversation, the Ukrainian president spoke about the possibility of having these mediated talks, which would be mediated by the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Germany. President Putin responded to that. He was slightly more cautious about the possibility of those talks. He said that, first of all, he wants to see elections in the Ukrainian parliament, see how that plays out, and he said he wasn't sure whether those countries would be willing to mediate those talks. So clearly there's a very long way to go before we can get to the possibility of having those peace talks. But I think the fact that the two leaders are talking will be an encouraging sign to many people who hope to try and end this conflict in eastern Ukraine that's been going on since 2014.
Harry, I mean, Ukraine's president, I mean, he was voted with a huge, strong outcome by the public. I mean, he was a former comedian even, so he's considered experienced, no? But I mean, do you think he has the negotiating skills to strike a deal with a staunch and veteran president like Vladimir Putin?
Well, that's a very good question, and in short, it's a question that we don't know the answer to. There's still an awful lot about Vladimir Zelensky that we don't know, because his election was such a surprise. He wasn't a politician previously. You know, he was famously, of course, he was an actor who played the president on TV. So we don't quite know enough about what his negotiating style will be with Russia, what concessions he might be prepared to make with Russia as part of these talks. What we do know is this is a priority for him. At his inauguration, when he became president of Ukraine, he spoke about how it was a priority to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and as he put it, to run the parts of the country that have been annexed by Russia. So this is something that he wants to see resolved and something he's keen to pursue. But how exactly he plans to go about doing that, that's still a question we don't know the answer to.
Well, it seems, I mean, this is a new approach by Russia, because they warmed up to Europe last month as well with the Normandy format talks hosted by France, and President Medvedev was there. Do you think France had a role in this, Harry?
Well, pretty important. You know, clearly having other countries to mediate these talks is essential to try and move them along. But you know, another complicating factor here, and critics who point out that peace talks have failed to progress really in the past 5 years. One of the reasons they put forward for that is the fact that the European Union has imposed such heavy sanctions on Russia for its annexation of Crimea. Critics feel that has been one of the major stumbling blocks towards moving towards some sort of peace agreement. Of course, France, as one of the key players in the European Union, has been a part of that. So that is an added factor here that presumably will be part of talks. At what stage during peace negotiations does the lifting of sanctions of Russia come into play? And again, it's not clear from the European Union's point of view when that threshold will be reached.
Well, that was our Moscow correspondent, Harry Horton. Thank you, Harry, for joining us on Indus News. Well, staying with Russia, and it's threatened the UK with retaliatory measures following a ban on its journalists. The UK's Foreign Office barred Russia's RT channel and Sputnik from a media freedom conference in London this week. Russia's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said British media organizations working in Russia should prepare to bear the consequences. Zakharova said London's actions were a propaganda attack on Russian media, and she went on to say the UK declined to explain its refusal to allow RT and Sputnik to the conference on the media freedom. London said that Russian news organizations were barred for spreading disinformation. Britain also declined to grant a visa to the Russian diplomat it had previously invited to attend the meeting. Now, British Prime Ministerial candidates Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt have promised to stand up for UK's top diplomats around the world. Surprisingly, this follows the resignation of Britain's ambassador to the US, Mr. Kim Darroch, over leaked memos that attracted criticism from President Donald Trump, calling him a very stupid guy. Foreign Secretary Hunt says he has written to all British diplomats promising always to back them. Johnson, the favourite to succeed Prime Minister Theresa May, went back to front by pledging to stand by UK ambassadors, but after refusing to back Durrock earlier.
The UK will stand up for the UK interest. The UK will stand up for, and I will stand up for our fantastic diplomats across the world. I just don't think that their careers should be used as political footballs.
Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has asked her Social Democrat coalition partners not to thwart Ursula von der Leyen's bid to lead the European Commission. She criticised the SDP party for failing to back the German defence ministers for the EU's top job. Merkel said the opposition to von der Leyen has created a domestic political crisis, which has impeded governance in Germany. MEPs have alleged the German minister's nomination was forced on them. Earlier, incumbent EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said von der Leyen's nomination was not transparent. The European Parliament will vote on her nomination next Tuesday. 61 people have been killed over the past week as heavy rains and floods swept through much of China. The Emergencies Ministry said it has evacuated 356,000 people from their homes. It said the floods in southern and central China have caused damage amounting to $2 billion. The extreme weather has also spoiled some 400,000 hectares of farmland. More heavy rains are expected to raise the risk of flooding in upstream sections of the Yellow River. Now, flash floods triggered by incessant rain have killed 5 people in northeastern India. The states of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh are the worst hit by recent downpours. Officials in Assam say 3 people were killed in the flooding and 2 others died in landslides. The officials say over 400,000 people in Assam have been stranded. No let-up in the rain is expected for the next 2 days at the very least. Now, the Commonwealth Secretary-General Patricia Scotland has said Pakistan's role in peace building is unprecedented. Meeting Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi in London, Secretary Scotland lauded Islamabad's role in regional stability. The Secretary-General said Commonwealth is committed to promote peace around the globe. Now in Turkey, the Central Cappadocia region hosted a hot air balloon festival, attracting visitors from around the globe. Colourful air balloons decorated the sky, making the region even more beautiful. Have a look at this in this news report.
Cappadocia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is famous for hot air balloon trips and fascinating underground cities. The 4-day festival was aimed at attracting more tourists.
I brought my own balloon from Belgium, Bobo the Happy Lobster, and we're about to take off over here just behind Love Valley for a nice flight.
Some 150 hot air balloons took to the sky for 6 different flights every day.
Up or go down, that's all. And then you have to search the direction of the wind, and so you have a little bit possibility to have a direction. But for that, you have to be a very good pilot.
Tourism sector contributes substantially to Turkey's economy, with Cappadocia being one of the country's top tourist destinations.
Now, a gym in California is using calories burned up by its clients to power up the building. The gym owner says one of his spin classes can generate anywhere between 1,000 to 2,500 watts of electricity. More in this report.
These exercise bikes may look like regular gym equipment, but there is one important difference. They have dedicated inverters similar to those found on solar panels or wind turbines. This means the bikes can turn watts generated during a workout into electricity.
So it just really depends on the individual and how fast they're going. But on average, you'll at least produce 20 watts, with a 20-minute workout. So 1 watt per minute if you're just going the basic resistance. But if you want to kick it up a notch, you can honestly make anywhere close to 50 watts in those 20 minutes.
Sacramento ECO Fitness also has similar non-motorized treadmills. Many members say they joined the gym to use the eco-cardio machines.
Combining fitness and something that's, of course, really good for you and the environment is just probably one of the best ideas that anybody could ever come up with.
The gym owner says this is only the beginning. He says he wants all the gyms to follow his model, using excess energy to power city blocks. But for now, the energy produced during one of his spin classes is only enough to power a fridge.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Indus News. Now, business news. Washington has accused China of going back on its promise to increase American farm imports. President Donald Trump says Beijing is letting the US down by not importing agricultural products. He hopes China will soon start buying farm goods soon. The statement comes after the US and Chinese trade officials had their first contact to revive negotiations that nearly collapsed in May. Since last year, the two countries have traded tariffs of more than $360 billion in two-way trade. Well, staying with the President Trump, and he's told Facebook to obtain a banking license before it's launching its cryptocurrency Libra. Trump said any company wanting to operate like a bank must be subject to all banking regulations. The US president said digital currencies are not money and can enable criminal activities such as drug trafficking. Trump said he's not a fan of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies because of their extreme volatility. US Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and Bank of England Governor Mark Carney have also opposed Facebook's planned digital currency. Carney said Facebook must show Libra is rock solid before even receiving permission to launch the cryptocurrency. Now, US stocks rose as investors ended a record-setting week on a high note. This comes after remarks from the Federal Reserve chief signaled a rate cut. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed 150 points and hit an all-time high. The S&P 500 traded 0.2% higher, while the Nasdaq Composite advanced 0.3%. Investors have been piling stocks amid hopes that the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates later this month. Now, car giants Volkswagen and Ford have announced expansion of their alliance to develop self-driving cars. VW says it will invest $2.6 billion in Ford's self-driving unit to market new technology vehicles in the US and Europe. Ford plans to deliver over 600,000 electric vehicles to Europe in 6 years' time by using Volkswagen's electric toolkit. The new vehicles will enter the market by 2023. Volkswagen's chief executive says the alliance will help the company drive down its costs in making zero-emission electric vehicles. Well, it's 34 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Oh, thank you for watching. That was the news. We'll be back on the hour with headlines. Stay tuned.